Hey, welcome back. Well, I'm working on this speeder model now, and I'm just getting these parts prepared for moulding, and I've decided to do something a little bit different with this because I'm intending to cast these pieces onto this carbon shaft here so that everything is nice and straight and it all links together as one unit. Now what I want to do is to cast this piece over the top of a length of brass tube, just so that this doesn't change shape and I can slide this whole assembly onto that carbon shaft. But to do that I can't cast it with the shaft in it because it doesn't leave me clearance for the brass tube. So what I have to do is insert the carbon tube, add the ferrule to the ends, and then I'm going to blank off each end, and then in the mould there'll be a shelf where a cut length of this can sit whilst the rest of the part is cast around it. So you'll have a piece of brass running all the way through, which means these pieces should slide no worries at all. So what I've got to do is prep these parts, fill these areas, get the piece of brass in there, fill the other section here, fill all these little holes and undercuts, and prepare these parts for a two-part mould. So what I'm trying to do here is make a mould with two parts. Normally you'd bury half of these in some kind of clay, mould the top bit, strip the clay out of all the bits and redo it again. I'm saving myself a bit of time by putting a perspex shelf as the division and sealing the parts to the shelf and then sealing the shelf to the box. I'll pour the first half and then you end up with a two-part mould like this. So just whipping it out. That big undercut pops out pretty good. Everything is looking pretty sweet. It was a tricky old casting, that, to be fair. I ended up doing a couple of different pours to see which method worked out best, and yeah, I'm quite happy with those results. The tricky one was the long section at the front cast on the carbon. I had to put a little breather tube in the side there that I'm taking out, and then pop out the little nub, and the rest of it's straightforward. And that should come straight out. So on with the build. This is a quick run through of the kit. These are all the parts, and I'm going to be putting it together, showing you little pictures of each one of the instructions just so you see what the relevance is. There are a few bits of this build missing because I just totally forgot to film them while I was doing it. But you should see it's pretty straightforward. Once you get all the parts together, they fit really nicely. This is the most crucial bit, to be fair. The first spine. This is what sets all the position of all the other pieces. So this bit has to go together pretty well. But it's dead straightforward. Everything looks right, then it pretty much is right. So I've taped it all and now glued it all, and I'm going to work on to the next panels to add to this basic spine. I'm just making sure the front bulkhead actually fits flush on the top as best I can so the cockpit will fit nicely. And onto the lower intake. This was a tricky bit to work out how to build, to be fair, but once you get your eyeball in and you see what's going on, it's pretty straightforward. It just sits into the recess on the bottom surface of those bulkheads. A little bit of filing to do to get it to sit really nicely, and then what I'm doing is just roughly tacking it in position so I can see what kind of space I've got to use for the rest of the panels. And I'm going to flip it over and then start to add the top surface because we need that in order to align those properly. So two side panels going onto the top surface. They don't meet exactly on the top edge, which is perfect because that provides a small recess for the other two layers on the canopy to fit into, and it forms a kind of key. The nose section here is a little bit tricky because you've got a lot of very strange angles to work with, so make sure you get that taped and in position and you're happy with it before you run your thin CA glue down the edges just to solidify it. Adding the little tapered pieces to the front and the 1mm thick plasticard panel which makes the bottom surface of that nose. What I'm doing now is just adding the rear panels that bridge the gap around the rear bulkhead and give you the shelf that you're going to fit the cooling fins onto later on in the build. So now things are getting a little confusing. It's looking like some kind of transparent jewel, and it's very difficult to get your eye in to see what's going on. So at this point I pretty much give it a little bit of paint so I can see what the surfaces are doing. You'll notice that the gun turret panel that I've popped in there is on upside down. Now I've got the paint on it, I can't see the etch marks. So be really careful about which way up you have the panels, because they're transparent, it gets a bit tricky. I've already popped it off and flipped it over. I use a very small amount of very thin CA just to tack the corners into position before I'm ready to do anything. You can fracture them off with the CA if it's very thin and you've only got a very small amount. So do like stitches in super thin CA just on the corners to hold it. When you're happy, run a bit more in and let it solidify, and then on the inside surface add a load more medium CA just to make it super solid. It's quite handy working in transparent perspex. You can see what's going on inside exactly. So rear cooling fins, here we go. Each cooling fin has one of these 1mm plasticard pieces on either side. I use 3 bolts to line them up so that everything's parallel. I've already done one side in this shot, so I'm adding the second surface on the opposite side with these bolts. This is the rear cooling assembly, putting that together so you can see the spacers inside and how I think I'm going to assemble it to keep it square. It's going to be put together with bolts all the way through, check for square, and then glued, and then the bolts taken out, and the cavities for the bolts make spaces to put pipe work through the inside, so that makes it quite detailed. So now the cooling fin spacers. It's important whenever you're working with 1mm plasticard to sand the surface, get better adhesion with your paint, and it also takes off any little bulges around the edges that were made with the laser cutter because it melts the plastic. So it's important that you sand down all the surfaces of the 1mm plasticard to make sure that they're flat and true. So when they fit together with the spacers, you don't have any issues with them wandering because of a compounded 0.1mm thickness difference on the back edge compared to the front, that kind of thing. It does make a difference, so take your time and use some decent sandpaper to take those edges off. Now this is the final assembly. I've got 2 threaded lengths of 6mm rod. I'm stacking them all up, finger tight, no need to crank them up with a spanner. Once you've got them all happy and aligned, then you can move on to feeding the glue in. Right, that's all the cooling fins done. All got the plasticard either side of the 3mm perspex. They're bolted together on the bottom. I've checked it for square. It's about as good as I'm going to get. I don't want to clamp this top one because there's spaces in between a few of these for pipes to be visible through that gap. If I clamp that, that'll bring these nose in and give me a taper. So now I'm going to put some thin CA glue on. This is how I glue them together. Hopefully without gluing all these rods in place because they've got to come back out. So I'm just going to feed a tiny little bit of thin CA glue just on the top edge of these sections. Cooling fins. All right. Okay, so we're all solidified into a block, and now we've just going to run a file on that bottom edge. What I put is the majority of the glue on this bottom edge, because that is hidden on the bottom of this lip here. So we don't have to worry too much about glue intrusions and messing up in here, so that's not a problem. I've fed a load of glue down on the back here, as you can see. That's all been done with a kicker. What I'm going to do now is just run a file over that back surface. Now run a file just along the bottom edge. Make sure, because these are quite a fine tolerance fit into that space. So let's have a look, see if anything flies off. If it's too thick, if I've got this alignment wrong, this top piece might lift off. That's why I don't glue everything super secure to start with. So let's have a look. Middle one goes down the center line of this, and it should fit in there. Definitely need this because I'm using super thick CA. So now I'm just going to dump a load on the back here. This is very thick. Some of it will penetrate into the assembly, which is fine. And the rest of it can go on the back of here. Got it in position. I'm pressing it in. I'm just going to dump some kicker in there, fair amount, because it'll find its way down through the layers. The thick CA glue skins over and doesn't really penetrate deep unless you've got really good contact. So anything in there that's got a thickness to it will have a skin where the CA kicker hits it, and it'll be liquid in the middle. So you've got to wait for that to actually do its job and go through the CA glue. Keep your pressure on while it's thinking about it. So that is one rear set of fins on. I painted them black first because you can't get your black paint into those deep recesses. The pieces in the middle that are separating the veins, I haven't bothered painting them because I can shoot those with an airbrush down this way, and I didn't want to paint the faces with the glue on to get a slightly better adhesion. Of course, that leaves a few unsightly holes on the end of this. So the final bit is to get the final cover somewhere there. I'm going to put a little bit of glue into each one of these pipe detail holes. Thick CA on the back of this. Next thing to do is this panel. This fits on the back here, and a fraction down just there. Same again, bit of thick CA. That was the best way I could come up with to keep all these square while you're assembling it. There's a little undulation, very, very tiny, but I don't mind that. Makes it look a bit more real world. Everything's kind of like, you know. But without those bolts, the alignment of this becomes really, really problematic. So here we go with the cockpit build. The cockpit is a tricky bit, to be fair. Take the 4 parts, tape them into position, make sure that you've got enough space to be able to add the front panel and make it flush with the front of the speeder. You don't want a little step there. So fiddle around with these and get them into the position that you want before you start to do stuff. Then make sure you've sanded all the bits, both sides. Then you want to paint the outer surface of those panels the colour that you want for your model to be. It just makes it easier because you only end up touching up areas that you fill, and you're less likely to spray the windows if you've already got the edges of those pieces already painted the colour that you want. So I'm sanding down all the edges, making sure they're flat, giving them a quick hit of paint. Now they're ready to fit on. I'm making sure that everything's aligned, and I'm just putting a very, very tiny bit of thin CA glue on the outer edge of those panels. Nothing dramatic, just a little bit to hold it in position. I'm stitching it with micro dots of glue as opposed to running a big bead down it. That's when you get problems. The rear lip on those, as you can see on the instructions, that helps you fold the rear window into place. No video of that, totally forgot to do that, sorry guys. But you'll see how it goes together. Roof scoop going on, a little bit of tweaking here and there to make it fit. Don't be frightened of using a file or sandpaper or anything just to manipulate your parts to get them to fit really nice. So just sanding down the edges of the roof scoop, getting them in place. Now I'm fitting the engines in again, just to make sure everything sits nicely. I want to know where the differences are, where things need to be tweaked. Cockpit canopy fits nicely now, sits in position. I'm checking the position of those little curved sections on the back. And now is the filler. You fill all your seams. Fill them with car filler. Trim them if you like before you sand them, just make them nice and smooth. That'll be all the edges on the top of the canopy. Side details on the canopy going on. The top bit overhangs the sides a little bit so you can file it flush to keep the thickness. Okay, so I've got these cast parts. I'm just going to file the edge straight. That curved edge on this cast part fits the curved edge on the bottom of this engine, and those two fit into this recess, so that one should go somewhere like that. Yeah, looks pretty good. And the one on the other side should do exactly the same. And onto the paint job. So this is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to talk you through this really, just put in a few little shades on the surface, trying to pick out a few panels just to knock them a shade lighter, nothing crazy. Don't want like a massive contrast in this, it's got to be super subtle. Just keep building up the intensity. I'm looking at the whole thing as a picture, so the balance of the paint job is quite important. You don't want things to be completely one-sided with weight, visual weight I'm talking about. So I try to work slowly and incrementally towards the weathered look rather than blast it all with one single hit, because I think the multiple layering adds an awful lot to the surface texture and how it looks to the eye. So I'm working with a little bit of masking fluid here. I'm going to do a two-part chipping on this. So the first layer is going to be a fairly light blue, just to give myself a difference when the next layer of masking goes on. Here it comes. I'm going over the same area but leaving a little bit of bleed each side. I've not painted these with a uniform colour because I want that difference in shading to be fairly apparent on the underlying layer when the top layer goes on. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But if you do it far too regular, it looks very, it looks a bit too graphic and a little bit too hard. You need to have that variation in density to get the eye to see it as a kind of real unit. So I'm using quite a thick Tamiya blue on this. I want the texture on the top, because once these are actually cleaned off, I'm going to hit those with a very fine sandpaper, a little sanding stick. And what that'll do is cut through the top of the surface imperfections and reveal a little bit more of the base coat through those two layers, and it'll blend these rather graphic looking marks together. So here we go, a little bit of sandpaper, and you'll see it instantly picks out loads more little dots where it's whipped that surface texture off. So now adding the main gun assembly. Be careful with this, you can snap off the end of those bulkheads if you're not careful. So I'm sliding them in, adding the various greeblies. There's a little one that tucks underneath this wing and just sits in that void there. Slide that all the way through and then pop the engine on the end. Right, so now we're ready. Use the cutouts that come with the kit to mask off your windows while you're doing all this. Makes it an awful lot easier than tape. I find it helps a lot, that makes things an awful lot easier. You can use the internal ones on the inside if you feel fit, although you should have already painted the inside the colour that you want before you glued those parts on. Adding a little bit of dirt now. This is a flurry wash, just a little bit here and there, just to pick out the details. This is kind of like sketching. You're sketching on the surface, seeing if you like the position of a piece of dirt. If you don't like it, wipe it off, try again. But you're going over it, keeping your eye on the whole thing. I want this to be considerably dirtier at the back than it is at the front. So I'm building up the intensity from front to rear. I want some rust on there, but I don't want it super vivid. It's got to be subtle. We're trying to keep these things in, in scale if we can with the weathering. So nothing too super technical, nothing too sharp. This has got to register as if it's the scale that it is. So a little bit of sponging, a thin Tamiya mix on there, which is my dirt mix, just to add a little bit of texture, going over it with a very light grey. That breaks up the monotony of that single colour, adds a little bit more depth to the paint job. And then what are we doing next? We're on to the bottom. So again, I want to pick out detail here. I'm not doing anything dramatic. I don't want the thing to look like a cartoon. I don't want masses of contrast between one thing and another. So here's what I do to paint kind of realistic looking dribbles across surfaces. If you do it with a brush, you're far too reliant on your own eye, and that's something that you don't want. You want to introduce a little bit of chaos into these, but they've got to conform to the look. So I like to use a little piece of cotton, dip the end in your chosen colour, drag it over the surface, give it a wiggle and let it go where it wants to go. And just keep doing them until you get something that looks good to your own eye. Now I'm adding the same colour again, just to the areas where I'd got that flory wash. You can see I've added black textured spray and a few little dabs of certain things on there. It's looking fairly messy, which is kind of what we want. I'm now adding the flory wash into the gaps, not all over, just a little area where I feel it needs to pick out contrast because the panels are not differentiated enough. I won't do it everywhere, but I will add it to areas that I don't like. Areas that look too bland, that don't have the texture that I want. Now I'm adding the little scratch marks with my, well, this one's a fiberglass stick, just rolled very thinly along the edges, just where I want to get that battered look to the edge of the panels. I'm going in a little deeper with this than I normally would because I want this to look a lot more weathered than the last one that I made. You can see I've added dribbles to where the petrol caps are or whatever they are. And I'm now going back in to highlight a few areas. I wasn't happy, it was all getting a little bit dull, and now I want to bring it back up again. I want to add more contrast to certain areas. So yeah, I want the white bit there. Don't like that panel. Bam, done, white. All right, that looks better. Gives me a nice contrast and it draws the eye in. Changes the balance of the model a little bit. The same on the top here. I want it to look like replacement panels. I wasn't happy with the blue stripe across the back, so I decided to dissect it with a white stripe on one of the panels there. That worked better for me. I'm constantly looking at the surfaces, trying to see what it needs. So I'm adding some brighter panels to the bottom now. So you've got 3 or 4 different colours of panels on the bottom, some very close to each other and some blatantly brighter. Just because I think it adds that little ident. It makes the eye more complex, it makes it less muted, and it brings back a little bit of life. Now I'm going in with a white on that stick to try and bring in a few highlights on the scratches, to blend the highlight into those white panels that I just put on. There will be weathering on those white panels, but you see how I'm working towards it. I'm looking at the thing and just trying to work out what it needs. Does it need a bit more here? Does it need to be darker at the back? Does it need to be darker at the front? Does it need scratching here? Does it, do you know what I mean? I'm just building a picture in my own mind and trying to get it to fit. So I'm intensifying the rust a little bit just to give it another layer with a slightly different colour. It's looking pretty good at the moment. There's still areas on the bottom that I need to do. There's no dark marks on the model. We've not hit the stage where I'm going for the darkest colour. This is a pass of buff, which you almost won't register. It's a cracking colour for Star Wars models, use a bit of that. Right, now I'm going in with a silver stick. A bit more sparingly on the body, but I'm going to add a bit more onto the back of these fins, because they would have been absolutely battered with all the landing and being fired at and everything and scratched. So they need to be quite ridiculously weathered. A few bits here and there on the body. Now we're going in with the darkest. This is not a black, it's a dark German grey. Done lightly in some areas, quite heavily in others, but I'm aiming to pick out the dark areas. I want to take them just a fraction further back. Not all over it. I'm hitting all the little scratch marks, all the little blast marks. Trying to get the thing to have a full range of contrast from the dark to the light, but nothing that invades you visually. Right, last stage, Dremel. Just rip it up with a drill. Go in and hack it to bits. Where you've got your darkest weathering and little bits that you want to change or freak out, just give it a go. Dig through the layers, it'll cut through all the different colours. Give you that really nice ILM scratch look. I'm now adding the number of ATATs that this guy's taken out. He's done 3, he's pretty good. A few idents just to add visual detail. You can do whatever you want, obviously. You can paint the whole thing pink if you like, I don't care. But that's the way I like it. So here we go, the final montage. Thank you very much for watching. If you want one of these, drop me a line. Cheers guys.